good afternoon. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for being with us as we step into the life of John McLinn Ross. John McLinn Ross is certainly a historic figure, as he is the first African American to earn the MFA from Yale, which he did in 1935. Beyond that, he's a historic figure because he opened up the field of theater arts to African Americans in a very great way by being a pioneer in creating and establishing strong theater programs throughout the United States at different historically Black colleges and universities. I thank Beinecke, all the good people there who have supported my work, assisted my research, and share in educating the community and reckoning with history. Certainly to Michael Moran and the team at Community Engagement, Jennifer Coggins, Tobias Cropper, and Jen Castellan. I thank you. So as we go to the next slide, we are going to start to take a light look into the life of John McLinn Ross. John McLinn Ross was born in New Haven, which I'm proud to say as a New Haven native, in 1895 in April. And he was certainly born into a world that was segregated. New Haven's Black community at the time was relegated to certain neighborhoods, primarily the Dixwell neighborhood. And the Rosses lived on Orchard Street, which is an extension of that Dixwell area. However, the Ross family was very different in the way that African Americans of that time were usually depicted. Educated, very active socially in the community, politically and civically active. The Ross family laid a wonderful foundation, a firm foundation for John McLinn to be able to grow and flourish and become the icon that he is today. And as you'll see in the next slide, not only were his parents strong individuals in his life, but they come from an even longer legacy of greatness and service. Next slide, please. So John McLinn Ross was the son of John H.W. Ross, and John H.W. Ross was also a New Haven native, and he had the good fortune of having a job as a U.S. postal clerk, which at the time was certainly a plum position to hold, as it provided one, job security, two, good wages, and John H.W. Ross was able to financially provide for his family and give them opportunities to be exposed to various cultural things and wonderful opportunities for learning outside of the classroom, but learning through life. John H.W. Ross was the son of Mary Jackson and John W. Ross, two sort of linchpins in the Black community of New Haven at that time. And as you'll see in the next slide, we have some very interesting backgrounds of the various family members. John's mother was Daisy Ernestine McLinn, and certainly she grew up in a household where she was in contact with many important people, as her father, Charles McLinn, was for 30 years the Yale College carpenter. In his work as the carpenter, Charles McLinn was able to come in contact, obviously, with masses of students, professors, and visiting dignitaries to the campus. Charles McLinn was also in charge of holding the university keys and doing other sundry jobs for students and faculty. So Daisy McLinn was very exposed, very worldly and educated. She herself was one of the first Black women to graduate from Hillhouse High School, which she did in 1888. She is the daughter of Ellen Skinner, and as I said, Charles McLinn. The Skinner family has an interesting history of their own, coming from North Carolina, both white and Black members. Ellen's mother, Charity Skinner, was willed a home by what is believed to be her white paramour, and she and her family resided in the Dixwell area in the home that the Skinners provided for Mrs. Skinner. Next slide, please. So here we have John W. Ross, the grandfather of John McLinn Ross, and he was born in Virginia in the 1840s. It is likely that he had some engagement with the institution of slavery. And family legend has it that he came to Connecticut in the company of a military officer, a Colonel Ives. And that's how he ended up here in New Haven. Certainly, John W. Ross um, acted as the patriarch of the family and a big man in the community, in lodges, in church life, and definitely, as we go on and we look at the life of John McLinn Ross, you can see that he certainly had a wonderful role model in his grandfather. Next. And this is Mary Julia Jackson, John McLinn Ross's grandmother, and the wife of John Ross. Mary Julia Jackson, again, the epitome of a woman of class and grace and dignity. She had been in New Haven for quite some time. Her father, a very old and respected citizen by the name of Josiah Jackson, born in 1790. So the Jacksons have had quite a presence in the life of New Haven and was certainly looked at as members of the old citizenry and cited as being from an old family. And in the next slide, we have John McLinn Ross, sort of the namesake of John Ross. Charles McLinn, as I said, was for 30 years the Yale College carpenter. He was born in Craven County, North Carolina, and came to New Haven looking to practice the trade that he learned in his youth. As a youth, he was apprenticed, as many of the boys in his area were, to learn the trade, and he learned carpentry and the skill and trade of being a joiner, and he came to work for Atwater Treat, a New Haven construction magnate, and then eventually found employment at Yale. Certainly, the arrival of Charles McLinn and other men from North Carolina who came with knowledge and skilled trades left a huge impact on the Black community, as many of the folks who were living here before had no great access to education or jobs in skilled labor. So when you have carpenters and machinists and blacksmiths showing up in New Haven as a group in the 1850s and into the 1860s, it really changed sort of the way that the community saw themselves and saw the possibilities. Many of these men went on to take leadership roles in lodges, churches, and in political life. And Charles McLinn certainly was one of those men. Special feat that he accomplished was becoming the first African American to be elected to office in the city of New Haven, as he was elected to the New Haven City Council in the 1870s at a time when New Haven ran on a city council system as opposed to an aldermanic system. And next. You can see that the Ross McLinn family lineage doesn't just stop with his ancestors. In particular, this is sort of delving into the presence of the family at Yale. Charles McLinn, as we said, worked there, and here are two family members who actually graduated from the institution. First, we have the Honorable Dr. John E.W. Thompson, who was an 1883 graduate of the Yale Medical School. And, interestingly enough, had the political cachet to be appointed by President Grover Cleveland to becoming the minister to Haiti from the United States. So certainly was an early Black diplomat. As many of you may know, Frederick Douglass held that post, as did Ebenezer Don Carlo Bassett, a man who was familiar to the Ross and McLinn families. And on the other side, we have the Reverend George Christopher Booth, who graduated from the Yale divinity school in the 1870s. And these two men became uncles to John McLinn Ross by marrying two of his mother's sisters. All of those women were daughters of Charles McLinn. So what we can see is in Charles McLinn's advantageous occupation at Yale, he was in prime position to introduce his daughters to young Black men who were having the new opportunity of being formally educated at Yale University. And certainly it worked out well in terms of establishing a grand legacy for the McLinn Ross family. Next slide, please. And here we have two other relatives of the McLinn Ross clan. We have two cousins of John McLinn Ross. At his time at the university, he would have been somewhere in between these two cousins. First, we have Nerissa Whittington Tyler, who was the first scholar taught by the famed pianist and music teacher and first African-American woman to graduate from Yale, Helen Hagen. Miss Tyler was Helen's first student, and obviously Helen Hagen must have been a wonderful teacher because her first student was able to accomplish the grand feat of receiving acceptance to the Yale School of Music. On the other side, we have Dr. Ira McLinn Mason, who was the grandson of Charles McLinn's brother, Henry. Dr. Mason attended Yale College and then went on to earn a medical degree and practiced in Chicago. And so having these folks shared with you should give you all some understanding of what was happening in the Ross family, what their values were, what the culture was like, and certainly that the presence of African Americans at Yale University might be different than what many may believe, as in this one family already you have four people who we've seen who were students at the university. And in the next slide, you can see that John McLinn Ross himself was a student at Yale College entering in 1912. Before you, you have a list of freshmen from the who entered in 1912, and highlighted in yellow, you can see John McLinn Ross living on Orchard Street as a student. And next slide. While at Yale, certainly he was focused on his studies, and in between, he was able to forge a bond and a relationship with other students at the university, other Black students. And that was pivotal to sort of his peace of mind and his being able to sustain as a student there. The environment was not always inviting. Many instances of open racism the students faced. And so bonding together and having a group of people you could rely on and share experiences with were pivotal to their success. And so John McLinn Ross was initiated into the rather new fraternity, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity incorporated, and Yale's chapter is the Zeta chapter, which is very old in the history of the fraternity. In this group, you have a bunch of dynamic individuals, men like John Lewis, who went on to become the president of Morris Brown College, and the father of historian and author David Levering Lewis. You also have men like Philip Thorne, who was a legal eagle and a trailblazer in the field, and certainly one of the moving forces and sort of the legal strategy of the NAACP. And you also have other luminaries who came through Zeta chapter around the same time as John McLinn Ross, Charles Wesley, who was a noted historian who went on to write the history books for many Black men's organizations, and Charles Wesley himself was president of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. And so these are the guys who John McLinn Ross was rubbing elbows with and looking to for support. Next slide, please. So interestingly enough, and I'm sure there's a question for folks who have kind of delved into the life of John McLinn Ross. He leaves Yale. And here before you, there's an article from an Indianapolis African American paper, sort of mentioning college students who were off to school and where they were going. And as you can see, John McLinn Ross is leaving Indiana to go to the University of Illinois. I do not know the exact reason at this time why he left Yale for the University of Illinois, but I can tell you that following in this list after John McLinn Ross is George Chester Booth, and George Chester Booth was a Ross cousin through the McLinn family and George Booth. And so they were at Northwestern and in Illinois. Also, the Booths um, lived in Indianapolis, where they were very active in the women's suffrage movement. And so, what I can tell you is that John McLinn Ross was taking advantage of the wide network of relatives and social friends who had fanned out across the country. Next slide. Here we have Ross in the Great War. He was not able to complete studies at the University of Illinois, obviously interrupted by the Great War, also known as World War I. And on this slide, you have two pictures. One, the first is a plaque, and this is dedicated to members of the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church, where the Ross and the McLinn families were members. And this plaque honors those who served in World War I. And of course, John McLinn Ross is on this list of folks who served in World War I. On the other side, you can see from the New York Age a clipping which lists those who had received commissions. So what we know is that John McLinn Ross served in World War I and in an officer's capacity. And certainly, I would say his collegiate education at Yale and the University of Illinois qualified him to serve or be deemed to serve as an officer. Next, we see that following the war, John McLinn Ross returns to New Haven. And in New Haven, he is sort of getting back in touch with the community. He's doing that through his church, the Dixwell Congregational Church, where a close family friend and fellow Yale alum, the Reverend E.F. Goen, presided as the pastor of the church. And Reverend Goen certainly was an inspiration to the folks in the neighborhood, not only with his various degrees and his educational background, but with his kind and common touch. But he also developed at the Dixwell Church what is known as an institutional church, one that served more than just the spiritual needs of the community, but also served the community providing services. A mother's milk station, providing physicians at the church for new mothers, a water fountain, a gymnasium, scouting opportunities, and other things. And so that building that you see there, the Dixwell Q House, is a community center that was established in 1924, an outgrowth of the institutional programs at the Dixwell Congregational Church. And John McLinn Ross fell into employment there at the Q House, involving himself in all manners of work. But one thing in particular that touched him was working with theater groups and dramatic arts. And on the other side, you can see there a clipping from a newspaper that describes John McLinn Ross as the chair of the selection committee. And certainly he was someone who kind of helped to figure out what kind of plays and what kind of acting they'd be doing for their season. So he was someone that people at the institution and the community looked up to. Next. John McLinn Ross being back in New Haven, we have two articles talking about his presence. One, the Dixwell Players, a write-up about the Players, which is the theater group that grew out of the Dixwell Q House. Early in the 1900s, around 1902, a theater group was established through one of the members at Dixwell Congregational Church. And that stayed there at the church until the opening of the Q House, where that group went on to become the Dixwell Players. And the Dixwell Players ended up being very good and award-winning, and they even went on to win several times a prize offered in a competition at Yale University for theater groups. And this was a huge accomplishment, not only just because they did well at their task, but because their success as an African American theater group to win this prize, not once, but several times, sort of flew in the face of stereotypes and myths about the intelligence and the capabilities of African Americans. And on the other side, you can see a newspaper article talking about one of the major programs of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity incorporated, which is the Go to High School, Go to College campaign. And here it lists folks who served as statewide chairs for that program. And John McLinn Ross was chairing Connecticut's programming around that subject. Next slide, please. Black Ivy. I call this area Black Ivy because, you know, John McLinn Ross, even though he did leave Yale, and it's interesting, in his alumni file, shared through the wonderful work of the Yale Archives and the Pine Bluffs Library, he writes himself that he loved Yale. And even if he hadn't gone to Yale, he would love Yale. And clearly, with the background that we went over previously, we know that the Yale blue flowed through his veins and had for many generations before him. John McLinn Ross entered into MFA studies at the Yale School of Drama in 1931. So, undaunted by the fact that he had taken a swing at collegiate education, he pressed on and looked to further his own higher education. Interestingly enough, the program he enters into is a master's program. But at the time, I don't think he had a bachelor's degree. And so in the next slide, you'll see some interesting things because while he was there, this was an important time for the Yale School of Drama because there were a number of African American students there with him, one being Ann Cooke, later Ann Cooke Reed, after marrying the noted Professor Ira D.A. Reed, and then Owen Dodson, well-known and respected playwright, both educated alongside John McLinn Ross. And while in New Haven, Ann Cooke lived in the home of the Reverend E.F. Goen, who was McLinn Ross's pastor. And so they developed a relationship outside of school, but it bonded this group. And, you know, it was very important because not only were they close classmates and collaborators while they were at Yale, but they also formed a relationship that went on to affect universities all over the country. Next slide, please. Here we see a Yale and a HBCU connection. Before us, we have a copy of an announcement for the Atlanta University Center, Atlanta University Summer Theater Workshop. And I used Atlanta University and Atlanta University Center because that describes two different things. The Atlanta University was a standalone university that did undergraduate education since 1865, and then in the 1930s switched over to solely graduate education. And that was because a number of schools in Atlanta had entered into affiliation, Morehouse College, Clark College, Spelman College, and the three schools, Atlanta University, Spelman, and Morehouse, were situated in adjacent plots of land. And so the combined groupings of those schools is called the Atlanta University Center. And so Dodson and Cooke Reed and John McLinn Ross were in Atlanta together, bolstering this theater program, which already existed in a small way, but certainly their combined efforts really sparked theater in the AU Center, and in the city of Atlanta. Following that model, other historically Black colleges and universities looked to fortify or establish their own theater programs. Next slide, please. And here we have a heading. John M. Ross gets degree from Yale and Morehouse. How is this possible? So in 1934, John McLinn Ross receives his bachelor's from Morehouse and the MFA from Yale, 1 month apart. Apparently, John Ross was working on his bachelor's, which he completed in 1 year's time, and then a month later received the MFA. And the caveat to receiving the MFA was that he complete his bachelor's degree first. So he was obviously intelligent and very hardworking. This achievement allowed him to become Yale's first African-American recipient of the Master's in Fine Arts. Next slide. Professor Ross. After graduating with his MFA, it becomes national news, and certainly he is now in demand to come and do much of the great work that he, Dodson, and Cooke had done together in Atlanta. And so offers came to him from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he not only worked in the theater, but also in dramatic arts of speech, which is very important in terms of developing people's public speaking skills. And then also Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana, called for the expertise of Professor Ross. Also, back in Atlanta, Morehouse College, Spelman College, also procured the services of Professor Ross. And then finally, the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff beckoned Professor Ross to come and establish a strong theater program there, which he did. And the mark that he left on the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff was so great that the theater troupe in his honor is called the John McLinn Ross Players. Next slide, please. The legacy of Professor John McLinn Ross can be seen in many ways. Certainly, we must start with this gentleman in the picture, Dr. Hubert Ross, who graduated with a graduate degree from Yale, just like his uncle and other members of his family, inspired by the work of John McLinn Ross. Hubert attended Yale and went on to be a professor in the Atlanta University Center, and he himself was a graduate of Morehouse College. You also have the direct impact on the New Haven community with making, learning how to write plays and act, and other facets of the arts. Certainly, it's been a big part of the legacy in New Haven, and a big part of educating young people. Even today, people from all over the world talk about the number of arts opportunities in the city. I would say John McLinn Ross was definitely impactful in inspiring that legacy. The Dixwell Children's Creative Arts Center was an art center that existed from the late 60s until the late 1990s, and that was centered and housed in the Dixwell Congregational Church, the church home of John McLinn Ross. Certainly, I can tell you that his efforts at the Q House with the Dixwell Players, his work at Yale, and his work at HBCUs were definitely on the minds of the folks who crafted the Art Center. Also, John McLinn Ross's legacy can be felt at historically Black colleges across the nation. Atlanta University is now Clark Atlanta University. They have a thriving theater program. Spelman College and the Baldwin Burroughs Theater certainly is doing excellent work in theater arts. The John McLinn Ross Players at the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff are still doing awesome things in 2023. And also the fact that many of these schools have a theater major, I would say was certainly influenced by the early work of John McLinn Ross. Also, you can find the legacy of Professor Ross at Yale University and the Yale School of Drama, with over the last few years seeing so many graduates of color going on to do big work. And we know because they have become quote unquote famous, becoming movie stars and stars of television and Broadway, certainly without the pioneering scholarship and the pioneering presence of John McLinn Ross earning that MFA. None of the people such as Angela Bassett, Courtney Vance, Charles Dutton, August Wilson, who also was greatly influenced by the Yale School of Drama, folks like Lupita Nyong'o and others are remnants of John McLinn Ross's legacy. I also should talk about his actual family members who shared information with me. I have the good fortune of having some of these folks in my social network. And so with just a few degrees of separation, I was able to make contact and establish a great rapport of collaboration with members of the Motley McLinn Ross family. Also, Professor Ross was a husband and father, grandfather, and he leaves a literal legacy with the Turnquist family and others who I'm sure are proud and they are thriving and alive today. I would also like to say that one thing that I didn't share in the slide is that John McLinn Ross was not just a dreamy artist, not just a elite son of Black privilege and the Ivy League. He was also an activist, directly and indirectly. He was once discriminated against and sued over not being allowed to stay in a motel. And, you know, for him to have taken that on, he certainly was a man who was brave, but is certainly a man who knew that he should not be denied any basic civil rights that all Americans were entitled to. And he was willing to fight for it. So John McLinn Ross, much like a friend and I'd say collaborator, Paul Robeson, much like Paul Robeson, Professor Ross was a Renaissance man. He was able to do many things and do them well. Quite the character, also known as Mac to his friends, Uncle Mac to his nieces and nephews, a colorful character who brought a spark of life, but also a golden intellect and true integrity to his work in theater arts and academia. And we're all the better for my Morehouse brother. And I'd say I'm a legacy of John McLinn Ross as well, following in his footsteps, being an extension of the long legacy of the Ross and McLinn families at the Dixwell Congregational Church, where I serve as chair of the History Committee. I am a legacy of John McLinn Ross as well, and I'm all the better for it. And in closing, I encourage all of you to delve deeper into the life of John McLinn Ross and other unsung heroes, everyday heroes, who made great contributions to academia, to community life, to politics, to American life in general, and lift up those who are often left in the sort of dusty boxes of history. Thank you.